Begin by settling in. Take a deep breath. Let your day fade gently behind you. Perhaps you're listening from your bed, perhaps somewhere quiet and soft. Or perhaps you're simply drifting into a peaceful place within your own mind. Wherever you are, allow yourself to let go just a little bit. Allow yourself the softness that stories like this one offer. A softness hidden beneath layers of thought, experience, and quiet reflection. This is a story about a boy who dreamed deeply, who felt more than he spoke, and who eventually left the world he knew behind, stepping boldly into the wild unknown. Christopher Johnson McCandless was born on a bright day in February in the year 1968 into a home that, to all eyes looking from the outside, appeared normal enough. His parents, Walt and Billy, were hard-working and ambitious. Walt was a prominent aerospace engineer. He held high expectations, pushing himself and sometimes others to excel. Billy was intelligent, supportive in her own way, though quieter. Their home, in suburban Virginia, had the clean lawns, the tidy hedges, and the comforting illusion of quiet happiness that suburban homes so often do. But behind the neat facade, life had its complexities. Chris was their first child together. Walt had a previous marriage, children from another family. The edges of these two worlds sometimes rubbed roughly against each other. There were quiet tensions, moments of strain that lingered unseen, like shadows beneath bright surfaces. Even as a child, Chris seemed to sense these undercurrents more acutely than most. He was sensitive, not merely in emotion, but in a deeper, subtler way, as though he felt things beneath his skin, registering discomforts others might overlook. Chris had a younger sister, Karine, who was his closest friend in the early years of childhood. They played in the warm afternoons of summer, explored small patches of forest behind their house, whispering secrets and building tiny worlds only they knew. Karine was the one who later recalled these quiet shared moments, painting Chris in gentle tones as a thoughtful and protective older brother who rarely spoke about the storm he felt inside. In school, Chris was smart, effortlessly smart. He did well in his classes without much visible effort. His teachers noticed his natural curiosity, the way he asked questions no other students thought to ask. But he was also reserved, often keeping his deeper thoughts and ambitions hidden behind a shy smile. When he did speak, it was with a quiet confidence that suggested a depth well beyond his age. Even then, there was something restless inside him, something that often seemed to pull him away from others. During recess, while other boys kicked balls across fields or climbed jungle gyms, Chris would sometimes wander toward the edges, standing at the boundary fence, looking outward, lost in thought. What did he see beyond that fence line? What did he imagine waiting for him out there in the distance? It was not until he reached his teenage years that Chris began actively searching for something more substantial. He began to run, long-distance running, pushing himself far beyond the point of exhaustion. It was as if running, for him, was less about sport and more about quiet rebellion. A way of escaping, if only for brief moments, the invisible walls around him. He ran through suburban streets, into woods, over hills, and along riverbanks, feeling the wind on his face, tasting the freedom that came from solitude. Those runs became his meditation, a private ritual no one else truly understood. At home, things grew more complicated as Chris entered adolescence. Walt's expectations became more pronounced, his ambitions more intense. He pushed his son toward excellence, toward success, toward the same kind of stability and respectability he himself had achieved. But Chris resisted quietly, never openly rebellious, yet clearly unwilling to settle into the mold prepared for him. It wasn't anger exactly, nor defiance. It was something quieter, something more profound, a determination to find his own way, even if he didn't yet know precisely what that way might look like. High school came and went. Chris graduated near the top of his class with enough accolades to reassure his parents. He accepted admission to Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, a respected school where he'd pursue a degree that might lead to a conventional, respectable life. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. Inside, though, a different story was already unfolding. His college years became a time of quiet exploration. He read voraciously everything he could get his hands on. Tolstoy, Thoreau, Jack London. Books became his companions, their authors, his closest confidants. It was through these pages, through words penned by writers long dead, that Chris began to see the outlines of a different kind of existence, one far away from the manicured lawns of suburbia or the structured hallways of academia. He dreamt of freedom, of open skies, of mountains and rivers, of a life uncluttered by the demands of society. He did well at Emory, exceptionally well, yet he was not attached to the life he was building there. His friends found him pleasant, thoughtful, a bit distant perhaps, but undeniably genuine. But even his closest friends felt there was something about him they couldn't fully grasp, a piece of Chris he kept carefully hidden away. His parents, proud of their son's academic achievements, felt that he had finally settled into a path they understood. They watched from afar as their son progressed through his studies, unaware that with every passing semester, Chris's internal compass pointed increasingly towards something different, something further away from them, something deeper and wilder than they could possibly understand. It was during these quiet college nights, lying awake in his dorm room, with only the muted hum of distant conversations and the pages of his books to keep him company, that the decision was quietly made. Chris would not live the life expected of him. He would not follow the paved roads laid by those who came before. Instead, he would set out to forge his own path, one that might lead him somewhere beautiful, somewhere meaningful, somewhere wild. By the time he graduated from Emory, Chris had already decided he would abandon the money, abandon the car, abandon his possessions, and even his name, stepping into the unknown. This wasn't about reckless adventure or youthful rebellion. It was something deeper, something fundamental. An attempt to rediscover a kind of truth he believed had been forgotten by the modern world. On graduation day, Chris walked across the stage, accepted his diploma, shook hands, smiled at his parents, and posed for pictures. He embraced them warmly, lovingly even, but behind his eyes, he already saw a road stretching forward, a road that would soon carry him far away from everything he had ever known. And shortly thereafter, without fanfare, quietly, almost invisibly, Christopher McCandless set out. He had no idea exactly what awaited him. He had no certainty about the outcome. But he knew one thing: for the first time in his life, he was truly free. And so he left. There was no grand ceremony, no final speech, no carefully planned goodbyes. Christopher McCandless simply vanished into the country, quietly slipping out of the grasp of the known and into a life he hoped would be defined by freedom, openness, and clarity. In June of 1990, shortly after graduating from Emory University, Chris packed his modest belongings, left the money he had saved neatly behind him, and donated the rest, some $24,000, to charity. To an outsider, it would seem an astonishing, perhaps reckless, gesture, but to Chris, it felt necessary. It was as though these things were weights tied around his ankles, keeping him tethered to a life that never quite felt like his own. The moment he let go of these anchors, a profound sense of peace enveloped him. He left Atlanta in a yellow Datsun, worn down by use, carrying little more than some books, a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a stubborn determination to find out what living truly meant. He was not fleeing from something, he thought. He was fleeing toward something, toward authenticity, toward experience, toward life itself. The open road welcomed him like an old friend. Windows rolled down, the air was warm, tinged with summer heat and the faint scent of asphalt. He drove west without a destination. Highways unfolded beneath him. Landscapes changed, from lush forests to golden fields to the vast deserts of the Southwest. Each mile felt liberating, each mile further from his past, from the suburban streets and structured classrooms he had always known. His heart was full of the gentle excitement that comes with the unknown, the uncertain, and the open-ended. Chris had never before experienced such total freedom. There was no timetable, no syllabus, no deadlines to meet. Every morning offered new roads and fresh possibilities, but the journey wasn't simply aimless wandering. Beneath it all was a quiet determination to rediscover a deeper, forgotten connection to the natural world. It wasn't long before he found himself wandering into remote places. He turned down roads rarely traveled, gravitating towards solitude. He learned quickly how to rely only on himself. He cooked simple meals under open skies, slept in forests beside rushing rivers, and spent nights reading by campfire light. Jack London and Thoreau became his traveling companions, their words a steady whisper guiding his thoughts as the miles passed beneath him. His travels eventually took him deep into Arizona, where one night the old Datsun got stuck in a flash flood near Lake Mead. Chris stood quietly by, watching as water swelled around the car, rendering it useless, a mechanical corpse drowned by nature. Another person might have panicked or despaired. Chris simply stared for a moment, feeling oddly unburdened. The loss of the vehicle was symbolic, almost welcome. It was another tie to civilization being severed, another step closer to the absolute freedom he sought. Chris calmly emptied the car of his remaining possessions, taking only what he could comfortably carry, and then abandoned it there. He burned the little money he had left deliberately, as if performing a quiet ritual, watching the cash curl and blacken in the fire. He felt a quiet satisfaction. It was his declaration of independence from a world of comfort, convenience, and currency. He began hitchhiking, thumb outstretched beneath the unending blue sky, walking along the cracked edges of highways, waiting patiently for rides. Strangers picked him up, curious about this young man with the thoughtful eyes and quiet demeanor. He rarely said much at first, but if asked, he spoke softly and intelligently, sharing fragments of his journey without giving away too much of himself. Over time, he found himself encountering people who lingered longer in his life. Characters who saw in Chris something compelling, something worth remembering. There was Jan Burress, a kind woman traveling the country with her boyfriend, selling wares at flea markets and swap meets. Chris met John on the roadside, sharing a brief, friendly conversation that evolved into an enduring friendship. John felt an almost maternal fondness for Chris, sensing a deeper loneliness beneath his independence. They parted ways after a few days, but it would not be the last time they crossed paths. In South Dakota, he found temporary work in Carthage, a tiny town where grain elevators towered over endless fields of wheat. Wayne Westerberg, a rugged yet warm-hearted grain elevator operator, hired Chris for odd jobs, sensing immediately that there was something different about him. Chris worked diligently, quietly, often lost in thought, yet never absent-minded. Wayne grew fond of him quickly, treating him almost like family. But Chris kept his deeper dreams hidden. He would smile gently, nodding politely when asked about his plans, always leaving out the truth about his ultimate destination. The wild solitude of Alaska. It wasn't deception, not exactly. It was preservation. He understood that most people wouldn't fully understand his yearning for wilderness. How could they? How could someone living a stable, predictable life comprehend the magnetic pull of uncertainty? The appeal of stepping beyond the boundaries of what society deemed normal? Chris didn't romanticize nature's harsh realities. He had begun reading survival guides, meticulously jotting notes in the margins, preparing himself mentally and practically for the wilderness. He studied plants, berries, hunting techniques. He practiced setting fires, learned the simple yet crucial art of surviving without the conveniences of modern life. These quiet preparations revealed his deep respect for the wilderness. Nature, he knew, could nurture or destroy, and yet he felt no fear, only a quiet awe and an increasingly powerful desire to test himself, to face something larger and deeper than he had ever faced before. As he traveled, Chris began to refer to himself by a new name, Alexander Supertramp. It was both playful and profound, a declaration that the life he'd once known no longer bound him. He was now free to redefine himself, not as a son, not as a student, not even as Christopher McCandless, but as something new, someone more attuned to the raw authenticity of life, lived fully in the present moment. He journeyed next to the Colorado River, deciding impulsively to kayak down to the Gulf of California, despite lacking permits or extensive kayaking experience. On this journey, he navigated treacherous rapids, camped alone beneath immense canyon walls, and felt, perhaps for the first time, utterly free. The river guided him onward, teaching him patience, courage, and respect. Each night beneath the vast, star-filled skies, he wrote meticulous notes and reflections in his journal. His words were simple yet powerful, reflections of a mind growing clearer, stronger, and increasingly certain about its place in the world. When he finally reached Mexico, he found himself isolated in tangled marshlands and confusing waterways. He briefly panicked, unsure of how to navigate the complicated delta, but panic quickly gave way to calm determination. He quietly figured his way forward, paddling onward, trusting his instincts, learning lessons of resilience that would stay with him. Eventually returning to America, he wandered the Southwest, continuing to live lightly on the land, sometimes living off charity, sometimes working briefly. His lifestyle raised occasional eyebrows, but Chris paid little attention to judgment or concern. Each day he felt stronger, more attuned, more certain that he was moving towards something essential. In the rare moments when loneliness crept in, When doubt whispered quietly in the back of his mind, Chris would open his books. Thoreau reminded him of the beauty in simplicity. Tolstoy taught him the dignity in solitude. Jack London reignited his sense of adventure. These voices, these silent friends, reassured him, gently guiding him forward. Chris was becoming something different, something new. Each step took him further from the boy he once was, closer to the man he hoped to become. And yet, the greatest journey still awaited him. Alaska was calling, a place he'd always envisioned as a pinnacle of his freedom, the ultimate test of his ability to survive, to thrive, to truly live independently. He began to quietly prepare himself for the final leg of his journey. Every mile traveled, every night under the stars, every quiet conversation with a stranger brought him closer to the great unknown of Alaska, the place where he hoped, finally, to find whatever truth he'd been searching for. Spring came quietly, bringing with it a sense of renewal that resonated deeply within Chris, or Alexander, as he now fully identified himself. The landscape shifted subtly around him. Desert sands gave way to greener fields, forests reawakening from a gentle winter slumber, rivers swelling gently with melting snow. As the days grew longer and warmer, he felt himself drawn irresistibly northward, toward the great frontier that had haunted his dreams for years, Alaska. Chris spent the final months before heading north, living simply in various small towns scattered across the American West. He took odd jobs, mostly manual labor, saving just enough money for the journey ahead. He picked fruit on orchards, did carpentry in remote ranches, stacked grain, cleaned barns, and harvested crops beneath endless skies. His co-workers saw a quiet, determined young man who worked with surprising strength and resilience, who said little but listened carefully. They didn't know about the Alaska he carried in his heart, about the silent wilderness waiting patiently for him, thousands of miles away. His friendships during this period were fleeting but meaningful. He drifted gently in and out of people's lives, leaving a quiet impact wherever he went. Jan Barres and her partner Bob crossed paths with him again, sharing meals around quiet campfires, trading stories beneath starlit skies. Jan noticed how Chris seemed happier, calmer, more certain of himself, and yet she sensed a hidden intensity, something deeper, maybe even darker, an inner conflict that he rarely allowed others to see. He spoke openly with John about his plans to venture into Alaska. Jan tried gently to caution him, worried about the severity of such wilderness. But Chris smiled softly, acknowledging the risks while quietly affirming his readiness. His calm assurance both comforted and unsettled her, as if he knew something no one else could understand. They said goodbye beneath the warmth of early spring, not knowing it was for the last time. His travels next led him back through South Dakota, where he reunited briefly with Wayne Westerberg, the grain elevator operator in Carthage. Wayne noticed the subtle changes in Chris, a deeper maturity, a quiet resilience, but also something else, a clearer, sharper determination. Chris worked hard, carefully saving money for his final journey. Wayne offered him extra hours, extra pay, sensing how much this meant to him. He wondered silently about Chris's dreams, about the quiet seriousness that lay just behind his calm exterior. But he respected the young man's privacy, choosing instead to simply offer friendship and quiet support. When Chris finally left Carthage, it was with gratitude and quiet resolve. Wayne handed him a pair of sturdy boots. the kind meant for rugged terrain, wishing him luck with a firm handshake. Neither man said much, but both felt the gravity of the moment. They parted ways quietly, and Chris set his sights firmly northward, a deep peace settling inside him as he took his first steps toward the wilderness. In early spring of 1992, Chris began hitchhiking toward Alaska. Thumb extended beneath skies painted in shades of soft blue and gentle grey. The weather grew cooler the further north he travelled, forests becoming thicker, mountains more imposing. Each ride carried him closer to his goal, and each day saw his determination grow stronger. Along the way, he talked quietly with drivers, fellow travellers, and locals, often receiving advice, warnings, and wisdom about the wilderness he was about to enter. Alaskans especially warned him gently yet earnestly about the wild's unforgiving nature, how swiftly beauty could become danger, how easily nature could shift from friend to foe. Chris listened carefully, noting their advice, yet quietly resolved within himself that he was ready. He did not romanticize the harsh realities ahead. He simply felt certain he needed to experience them for himself. He reached Fairbanks in late April, a city that felt surprisingly modern and bustling compared to his dreams of pure wilderness. He paused briefly, purchasing minimal supplies: a simple rifle, a few boxes of ammunition, a bag of rice, matches, and a detailed book on edible plants of the Alaskan wild. The cashier asked him where he planned to hike. Chris smiled softly, offering only that he intended to explore the Stampede Trail near Denali National Park. The cashier looked doubtful, offered more advice, but Chris quietly assured him that he was prepared. One final driver carried Chris to the edge of the wilderness. Jim Gallion, a friendly, rough-edged Alaskan electrician, picked him up hitchhiking along the road near Healy. Gallion immediately noticed Chris's minimal gear: the small backpack, the thin jacket, the inadequate footwear. He questioned him, kindly yet seriously, worried by the young man's apparent lack of preparedness. Chris responded gently, confidently, telling Jim about his dream of living off the land, about finding peace and authenticity in nature. Gallion tried convincing Chris to reconsider, or at least delay his departure to better equip himself. But Chris's calm determination was unshakable. Jim felt a profound mixture of respect and concern. He offered Chris his own waterproof boots, a sandwich, and some extra food. Small tokens of kindness Chris gratefully accepted, sensing the sincerity behind Gallion's worry. As Jim dropped Chris at the head of the Stampede Trail, he handed him his phone number on a slip of paper, urging Chris to call if he made it back safely. Chris took the paper quietly, promising to keep it. They shook hands, said goodbye, and Jim watched Chris walk calmly, confidently into the wild. Chris felt no fear, only peace. His steps carried him along a trail, quickly fading into wilderness. Each step a quiet declaration of freedom. Around him, the Alaskan landscape unfolded, like something from his deepest dreams. Vast, untouched, utterly beautiful. Pine forests rose on all sides. Birds called softly through the branches. Streams murmured quietly beneath gentle breezes. The world was enormous, and he felt smaller than ever, yet strangely more alive. After days of walking, he stumbled upon an abandoned bus, the now famous Fairbanks Bus 142, left behind years earlier by hunters as a makeshift shelter. Chris entered cautiously, examining its rusted interior, and smiled quietly to himself. It felt like fate, a perfect home, simple and sturdy. The bus had beds, a wood stove, and windows through which he could see the beauty that surrounded him. He began carefully arranging his few possessions inside, creating a home in the wild, a sanctuary amid the wilderness. His days quickly settled into a gentle rhythm. Chris hunted small game, squirrels, rabbits, occasionally birds. He gathered edible plants and berries, guided by his field book. He collected firewood, built fires to cook simple meals, and each night wrote in his journal beneath candlelight. These were quiet, solitary days, filled with reflection and deepening connection to nature. He felt a clarity he'd never known, a sense of purpose, a profound and peaceful solitude. Yet even as he thrived in isolation, the wilderness quietly tested him. Rain fell relentlessly some days, soaking him and chilling him to the bone. Mosquitoes swarmed persistently, testing his patience and endurance. Food became more difficult to find. The animals grew warier, plants scarcer. His small bag of rice diminished quickly. Chris remained calm, quietly resolved, confident in his ability to survive. But slowly, quietly, the wilderness began revealing harsher truths. Chris attempted to leave the area in early summer, ready to reconnect with the world, only to discover the quiet stream he'd crossed weeks before was now a raging, impassable river. Trapped, yet not panicked, Chris calmly returned to the bus, prepared to wait out nature's quiet power. Inside the bus, his journal entries became quieter, more introspective. His thoughts turned inward, reflecting deeply on life, solitude, family, love. He felt no regret, no anger, only a deepening sense of understanding about himself and his choices. He had come seeking something authentic, something true. And even as the wilderness slowly, silently closed in around him, Chris felt he'd found it. There, in the quiet loneliness of bus 142, he lived fully, peacefully, and with profound clarity. Yet the line between survival and struggle was thinner than he'd ever imagined. He had reached the wilderness he'd always dreamed of, but the wilderness held secrets he had yet to fully understand. Days passed gently, quietly, in a rhythm determined solely by nature itself. Christopher, Alexander's supertramp, had found himself comfortably alone, isolated deep within the Alaskan wild, in the sheltering confines of the old bus. Each sunrise greeted him with a warm glow through rust-stained windows. Each night closed gently under vast starry skies. Time, in this world, lost its usual urgency. It became elastic, bending and stretching slowly, filled with simple tasks, thoughtful reflections, and quiet struggles. Chris found himself adjusting, bit by bit, to a life defined by minimalism and necessity. Each morning began with quiet rituals, the slow stirring of embers in the stove, a gentle breakfast of rice or berries, and the careful planning of his daily hunt or foraging. The air outside grew warmer as summer took hold, and for a while the wilderness appeared forgiving, even welcoming. Flowers bloomed brightly in fields around the bus. Wildlife occasionally wandered close, cautiously observing this curious visitor who had quietly made their territory his home. He hunted small animals, birds, squirrels, the occasional rabbit, with patience and respect. Each successful hunt filled him with quiet pride and gratitude. These were simple victories, yet they felt significant, each one reaffirming his self-sufficiency. But even then, Chris was careful, never wasteful, fully aware that nature did not give generously forever. Yet soon enough, reality began to shift subtly, quietly, beneath the gentle facade. The abundance of spring gradually gave way to a harsher, less forgiving summer. Animals became cautious, wary, retreating further into the thick forests. The easy hunting of his early days became difficult, frustratingly so. Chris felt the first stirrings of quiet anxiety as his modest supply of rice steadily dwindled. Still, he reminded himself calmly. This was the test he'd sought, the challenge he'd willingly embraced. He often walked the forests, scanning for edible plants he carefully identified using his guidebook. His eyes became sharper, more observant, noticing subtle variations among leaves and berries. Chris developed a quiet respect for the delicate balance of nature, understanding intimately now how survival was more fragile than he'd imagined. With each passing day, his awareness sharpened. Every meal was cherished, each bite savored, and each night spent beneath the stars carried the quiet satisfaction of a small victory. But solitude, while liberating, held a quiet, deeper challenge. The quiet persistence of loneliness. He had chosen isolation deliberately, yet the silence sometimes whispered too loudly, highlighting the absence of voices he once knew, smiles he remembered, laughter shared in earlier days. In those quiet moments, Chris pulled out his worn paperbacks, Jack London, Thoreau, Tolstoy, reading passages he had long since memorized. Their voices, distant yet familiar, gently reassured him, offering silent companionship in the loneliness. His journal became his greatest confidant. Each entry was brief yet filled with profound honesty. Chris reflected quietly on his experiences, his successes, and his occasional failures. He never expressed regret, only insight and understanding. He understood now that happiness was most powerful when shared. A revelation that came quietly, deeply, in the solitude of the bus. Yet even that understanding didn't diminish the quiet pride he felt in having achieved something so utterly his own. Summer deepened. Days grew longer, but each day seemed harder than the last. The mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly, their presence becoming a constant, maddening irritation. Chris wore thin layers, covering every inch of his skin. But they found ways to bite through, to remind him quietly of nature's small, persistent cruelties. He endured these discomforts patiently, understanding they were part of the test he'd chosen. He began to feel quietly weaker, more tired each day. Hunting became even more challenging, his reflexes slower, his patience thinning. Hunger quietly settled in, not dramatically, but subtly, like a whisper in his body. He gathered plants more desperately now, eating whatever he could safely identify, seeking sustenance in roots, leaves, berries. But the wilderness, vast and indifferent, offered less with each passing week. He decided finally that it was time to leave, to return to the world, to re-engage with life beyond this isolation. Yet when he reached the Teklanica River, he found not the gentle stream he'd crossed weeks before, but a raging torrent fed by melting snow and distant rains. Chris stood quietly on the banks, staring into the furious rush of water, realizing softly, heavily, that he was trapped. Returning to the bus, he understood quietly, grimly, the seriousness of his predicament. Back at the bus, his journal entries became shorter, quieter, heavier. The solitude he had cherished now began to press down on him, harder, heavier. He did not panic. Instead, he planned carefully, calmly rationing food, carefully preserving energy. He reminded himself quietly of his capabilities, his resourcefulness. He reassured himself softly, almost whispering to himself, beneath the silence of the wilderness that he could endure, he could overcome. Chris tried eating different plants, desperately seeking nourishment. One afternoon, he carefully picked a cluster of wild seeds he'd previously identified as edible. He ate them gratefully, trusting his guidebook, trusting his careful judgment. But something was quietly, tragically wrong. Within days, he felt weaker, nauseated, struggling even to move comfortably around the bus. In those quiet days, Chris realized with chilling clarity that he'd mistaken the plant. He'd eaten something subtly toxic, something harmful. The realization settled heavily, quietly, within him. He wrote in his journal, noting his error softly yet clearly, acknowledging his mistake without bitterness, anger, or self-recrimination. He simply accepted it as part of his chosen path, a quiet hazard of the freedom he'd pursued. His body grew weaker. He lay quietly on the old mattress, listening to birds outside, watching the shifting shadows of trees across the metal walls of the bus. Time stretched out, endless yet strangely comforting. Chris drifted quietly between consciousness and sleep, memories mixing with dreams. He thought of his family, his parents, his sister Karine. He remembered childhood afternoons spent playing in suburban yards, family dinners, moments filled with laughter, even through the quiet tensions he'd always felt beneath. He understood quietly, gently, that despite his profound isolation, he was not entirely alone. In those days, as strength quietly faded from his body, he felt deeply connected to the world he'd left behind. He wrote a short, poignant note addressed to anyone who might find it, explaining softly, simply, that he had lived well, that he had no regrets. The note concluded gently, asking for kindness toward his family, asking whoever found him to remember him as someone who lived passionately, fully, and with great sincerity. His final days were quiet, peaceful even. Chris accepted calmly that the wilderness had claimed him, not out of cruelty, but simply because nature was impartial, neither friend nor enemy. He had tested himself against something far larger, far more powerful than he'd ever imagined. He had sought truth, clarity, authenticity, and, in many ways, he had found it. He thought of the people he'd met along his journey. Jim Gallion, Wayne Westerberg, Jan Burris, each of them who had quietly offered kindness. He thought of the places he'd seen, landscapes he'd quietly absorbed, from the deserts of the Southwest to this vast, indifferent wilderness of Alaska. He felt profound gratitude, profound peace, despite the quiet, inevitable end he knew awaited him. Christopher McCandless, Alexander Supertramp, lay quietly within bus 142, beneath the gentle rustling of trees, beneath skies shifting softly from blue to twilight. He had lived fully, authentically. He had taken risks few others dared. He had loved deeply, though quietly, the life he'd chosen. In those quiet final moments, he understood gently, deeply, that the truth he'd sought had always been within him, yet he could only see it clearly here, alone, at the edge of the world. The wilderness claimed him softly, quietly, gently, and Christopher McCandless slipped peacefully into a deeper, kinder rest than he'd ever known. Months passed quietly before anyone found him. The Alaskan wilderness, vast and indifferent, carried on its rhythms unchanged, unaware of the quiet tragedy that had unfolded within its borders. Birds sang gently through summer days. Rivers flowed steadily toward oceans. Animals moved softly through forests. life continued in quiet indifference around the silent bus. In September 1992, several months after Chris had slipped gently into eternal rest, a group of moose hunters traveling along the Stampede Trail stumbled upon bus 142. Curious and cautious, they approached, sensing immediately a quiet, unsettling stillness around the bus. They opened the rusting doors carefully, stepping into silence. There, lying peacefully, his body now part of the quiet solitude he'd sought, was Christopher McCandless. Beside him lay his journal, neat and carefully kept. His final entries clear and simple. There was no panic in his words, no bitterness or fear. Just quiet acceptance, a gentle acknowledgement of his fate. His final note asked softly, with quiet dignity, for kindness toward his family, expressing gentle thanks to whoever discovered him. The hunters stood silently, profoundly moved by the quiet dignity of this unknown young man. Word spread slowly, quietly at first, then more insistently. Authorities soon arrived, recovering Chris's body, carefully, respectfully, from its gentle resting place. They began quietly piecing together the fragments of his life. His journey, his identity, the quiet determination that had led him here. His family, far away in suburban Virginia, learned the news quietly, painfully, in their living room. Grief settling silently into the spaces between them. For his family, the loss was profound and complicated. Walt and Billy were stunned into quiet grief. Kareen, his younger sister, felt the deepest pain. She remembered the quiet afternoons spent playing together. Whispered conversations shared beneath childhood scar. The quiet intensity of her brother's restless spirit. The family struggled silently with questions, with grief, with understanding. The quiet determination that had driven Chris so far from home. Yet as news quietly spread beyond his family, beyond Alaska, Chris's story began resonating deeply with strangers. People who had never known him personally began to connect profoundly with his story, his journey, his quiet yet fierce desire for freedom. There was something in his quiet rebellion against society, in his sincere pursuit of a life stripped of pretense, that spoke deeply to a generation seeking authenticity. His story reached writer John Krakauer, who had quietly wrestled with his own desires for adventure and solitude. Krakauer traveled to Alaska, retracing Chris's quiet steps along the Stampede Trail, visiting Bus 142, sitting quietly within its rusted interior, absorbing the stillness that had surrounded Chris in his final days. Krakauer understood Chris's quiet intensity, his profound yearning for meaning, and gently resolved to tell his story respectfully, truthfully, honoring Chris's memory without romanticizing or judging his choices. Krakauer's book, Into the Wild, published several years later, gently and quietly introduced Chris's story to millions. Readers absorbed his journey in quiet fascination. Some deeply inspired, others quietly saddened, still others profoundly disturbed by his tragic end. Yet Chris's story spoke softly, yet powerfully, to those who felt quietly disconnected from modern life, who sensed, like Chris, a deeper truth hidden beyond the comforts of civilization. Visitors quietly began trekking along the Stampede Trail, seeking Bus 142, compelled by a desire to stand quietly where Chris had stood, to feel the profound solitude he had experienced. The bus became a quiet pilgrimage site, marked by small offerings left behind, letters, photographs, mementos, each visitor quietly acknowledging the impact of a young man they had never met, but felt they deeply understood. Yet the legacy was complicated, Alaskans, quietly protective of their wild landscape, felt conflicted. Some admired Chris's courage, quietly respecting his passion for freedom and authenticity. Others quietly resented the risks he took, seeing his death as a needless tragedy. Quiet debates arose, questions gently asked about the nature of risk, about the line between courage and recklessness, about the responsibility of those who ventured into the wild. Even among those who knew Chris best, quiet reflections emerged. Wayne Westerberg quietly remembered Chris's hard-working, sincere nature, his quiet intelligence and genuine curiosity. Jan Burris felt quietly saddened, yet grateful for the brief friendship she'd shared with him. Sensing the deeper loneliness Chris had carried quietly beneath his smiles. Jim Gallion, the last man to see Chris alive, quietly wished he'd pressed harder to keep him safe, yet respected Chris's quiet determination and sincere desire for independence. The world quietly debated Chris's story, yet his family faced the deepest, quietest struggle. Karine grappled privately, gently, with understanding her brother's choices. She knew deeply, quietly, that Chris had found something meaningful, something essential in the solitude he'd sought. She remembered his quiet intensity, his thoughtful eyes, the subtle restlessness she'd seen within him since childhood. She understood, more clearly than anyone else, the quiet sincerity behind his journey. Years passed quietly, and Chris's story gently continued, influencing countless lives. Teachers discussed Into the Wild with students, sparking quiet yet profound conversations about freedom, independence, and responsibility. Travelers ventured into wild spaces inspired by Chris's quiet courage, carrying with them not recklessness, but respectful curiosity. The lessons quietly gleaned from Chris's journey guided others toward deeper self-awareness, quiet contemplation, and genuine appreciation for nature's beauty and severity. Yet Chris's most enduring legacy remained quiet, personal, intangible. In those moments when someone stood alone beneath a vast, starry sky, feeling deeply connected, yet profoundly solitary, they quietly remembered Chris. They remembered his courage, his sincerity, his quiet determination. They reflected gently on the thin line between passion and risk, between solitude and loneliness, between freedom and isolation. Chris's story gently reminded them that authenticity was not easy, not comfortable, but profoundly valuable. Eventually, decades after Chris had slipped quietly from the world, the state of Alaska decided to remove Bus 142 from the wilderness. Quietly, carefully, it was airlifted from its remote resting place. The rusted metal shell carried gently through the Alaskan skies to prevent further tragedies from occurring in pursuit of Chris's story. It was placed gently in a museum where visitors could quietly reflect on Chris's legacy without the inherent danger of the wilderness that had claimed him. But even with the bus removed, the spirit of Chris McCandless remained gently embedded in the Alaskan wilderness. His journey continued quietly resonating, a gentle echo carried by the winds that swept through forests, by rivers flowing toward distant oceans, by silent mountains towering above quiet valleys. Christopher McCandless's life was brief, quietly tragic, yet profoundly meaningful. His journey whispered softly of courage, sincerity, and an unyielding pursuit of truth. And in quiet moments of solitude, beneath skies endless and full of stars, his story continued, reminding anyone who listened carefully of the beauty, danger, and profound freedom waiting patiently beyond the boundaries of comfort. Chris had walked quietly into the wild seeking truth, and in the quiet depths of solitude, he had found it. His legacy remained gentle, enduring, quietly reminding us all that the search for meaning, no matter how quiet or solitary, is always deeply worth pursuing.